Hello, this is International Master and Author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. This will be my 10th lecture on isolated pawns and their relatives, or descendants as Nimzovich calls them. 10 seems like a lot, but it's really 4 different subjects so far. Anyway, we've covered pure isolated pawns, then isolated pawn couples, then hanging pawns, and last week we talked about the ram structure, showing an opening and then 4 games. Tonight I'm going to continue the subject of the ram, which usually arises from isolated queen pawn structures as explained. I'll assume that you saw the show last week and step right into more examples. So just starting right away, this game between Kasparov and Karpov, World Championship, towards the end, extremely important game. So let me just keep going. Black just captured on a3, so let's recapture that. And there's the big move. Karpov decides to allow the ram structure. Now, interestingly, while I was preparing for the show, I noticed that Karpov lost a lot of games by allowing the ram structure. He also drew a bunch. Considering how good he was, he probably could have won some of those games if he hadn't. So, very interesting decision for him to do that. He also won a couple with the ram structure as white, but I'm not real clear why he why he persisted in doing that. You know, who knows? Maybe he would have been 29-50. He just hadn't had his ram structure games. Anyway, and Kasparov took advantage of that several times. So here we are, and what have we got here? Actually, this looks like the old, well, it looks like several games we've seen, but see the bad bishop there on g6. If it was on e6, it would be sort of acceptable. It'd still be bad, but at least it would have more pressure. On g6, it really looks out of play, doesn't coordinate with the center, for one thing. So we have good knight versus bad bishop, and we already have the control of the open file, the e file, at least superior control of that file, which is another advantage. Okay, defends against g6 ideas, and white takes over the c file. So what we have here is pretty typical. He really has 2 serious advantages, not the good knight versus the bad bishop and control the file, and often in ram structures that's enough. Now that really shows that he has control of the file, because black couldn't really stop that last move without allowing other issues. And very simple example, really. We're not going to get too complicated here. So, but anyway. Okay, black simply moves over, and white goes after that pawn. And black doesn't defend it. So basically the active rook netted a pawn already. But it's not over. Black all of a sudden has an active rook, so that's something. White has that pass pawn, doesn't start pushing it yet because, you know, here's the f pawn under attack. Ironically, it doesn't have much to do with the game really, but remember we talked about that structure, those two together, which in this case doesn't make much difference, but generally is a very nice combination of moves. Black goes after that pawn. Now we see a beautiful combination. You may have seen it before, which really does exploit still, again, the better knight over the bad bishop. What he does is he gives back the pawn to give this check. That looks really good, right? But on the other hand, how's he going to get through here? Has he just given up a pawn for nothing? He plays that move. That's the hardest move because, well, I should say that if he had gone back here, then he gets caught on the last rank, and that's really not good. So then this clever move, which gets rid of the rook, and what good does getting rid of the rook do? It means that the king is less defended, as you'll see in a second. Okay, and that's an absolutely key move because it threatens this move, and guess what? That's checkmate. So you can see that this bishop is just getting in the way, and that the king is really trapped. Now that square is covered, but after queen d4, all of a sudden we have that move also. And that's really the end. So really there's not much left to even talk about here, because he resigns at this point. There's maybe a line we could briefly look at. Tries to make some room down there, but see, he's stuck. It's almost Sigsfang. And then here's a very simple way to end the game. Just here. Winning the ending. Okay, so that was quick, but that's good, because we get to go to another example rapidly. But you get the idea. Good knight versus bad bishop. Okay, let's stick with the same opponents, but this time in a rapid game, late in their careers. Not that important a game, but it's interesting what happens. I'm going to start from the beginning just because it's easier here. Okay, Queen's Gambit. Just moves. This is opening moves. You've probably seen this kind of idea before. F3 with E4. Something Kasparov made sort of famous, even though it had been played for many, many years before him. And guess what we're getting to? We're getting to the ram position again. So here's Kasparov again as white in the ram position. So Karpov must have been thinking, oh, not this again, 20 years later or whatever. And black simply develops. And there's that move that's so important. It stops bishop f5 or knight f5, but it also just gains space and creates a long-term problem for black, which is that he starts getting cramped. He starts having trouble knowing what to do. Okay, and we don't see exchange of queens that much, but it makes total sense, because you've got what? Good knight versus bad bishop and space. Okay, that's a very committal move. Now remember, this is a rapid game, so. Okay, we've seen the knight there, pressuring that a little bit. This square is important. Rook e5. We've seen this sort of thing before, and then of course good knight. Well, good bishop versus bad bishop. That's really the way to look at it. Okay. And there we go. I think that's interesting. When in doubt, grab more space. When you have these advantages in these RAM structures, you have the file. Either try to win the file more distinctly or gain more space. Maybe you can play h5. Maybe that'll support bringing the king up and the g5 at some point. So black really doesn't have that much to do. King usually goes to f2, doesn't it? Now it's typical that white in these kinds of positions really has his opponent tied down, and so he doesn't really have to hurry. Black, on the other hand, doesn't have that much to do. He's just going to reorganize a little bit, try and challenge the file for a moment. But then look what happens here. There, the c5 square, which we talked about before when black played b5. So now suddenly he has space, we know, the better bishop, we know, and even better file control, which should be enough to win. Okay, attacks the rook, gets a piece off at least, but white consolidates the file, moves towards the center a little bit, and unfortunately we don't have the end of this game, but you can see that good things are happening here for white. There's that e5 square that's a problem. I'm not sure exactly what happened. Probably they were blitzing and whoever was taking the score couldn't keep up. It's also possible that Karpov lost on time here, so it was a little bit early, but it was a rapids game. White's much better. It's definitely not resignable, but it's going to be very, very hard to hold something like this. f4 is certainly a theme. Knight e5 making a weakness first. White has plenty of time, and white, as we've seen, wins games like this most of the time. So let's move on. Okay, here we have a game, Stein-Petersons, the great Leonid Stein, who died prematurely, one of the great Soviet players. Let's just play the opening this time. partly because we'll get a little review, some very standard ideas. Semi-tirage often leads to our isolated queen-pawn position. And we've certainly seen this one before, all these moves. Bishop on c4, a3, and if you look for a second longer, rook on a1, bishop on a2, rook on c8. We've seen it all before, and bishop on g5. Okay. Both rooks to the center. This is sort of an ideal position for white, but not bad for black. Queen c8 is a little bit odd move. Actually, I think maybe the idea was to play bishop a6 at some point. Probably not the best of moves. Okay, and now there's a mate threat. Bishop takes f6, followed by queen h7. And he stops that, and guess what? Back again. Remember our maneuver? It doesn't hurt to review that. Happens again and again. So the d5 is often a threat. And of course we saw this come up various ways, whether, both sides won this game before. White's got the more practical chances here. Just maneuvering. Nothing special so far. That's to stop knight g4, I'm sure. Often bishop is at h6 by this point, so it's a little different because white's protecting that bishop. Okay, there's the move. Black's trying to simplify and exploit the isolated pawn after simplifying, or perhaps take here, which we've seen can often be very, very effective. The only problem is he's allowing that move where the extra knight is much better than the extra bishop. We have the ram structure. And now we see why the bishop hasn't gone over here, because the queen does a good job of protecting it. So now black doesn't look that badly off, but there's the same old problem. It's this typical thing where this bishop on b7 isn't doing anything. So let's just see how he handles all this. Okay, simplifies. Now he's hitting f7, so protects that, and now swings over to attack h7. And really here, white doesn't play the best move. He should simply come back and have a nice solid game, controlling all the good squares, controlling e5, and he'd definitely stand better. Nothing necessarily overwhelming, but definitely worth playing. Instead, he plays here, and actually gives black a little chance to sort of sneak out. Maybe that's not the best place for the queen. Now he plays the most natural move on the board. We've seen it before, covering f6, covering with f6, covering g5, and covering e5. The only problem is, of course, that's weakening. That weakens the e6 squared. He should have just played here, and it turns out this is very, very difficult for white to do anything about. Even though he has all the normal advantages, black's just a little too solid. And there's quite a few lines. And one possibility, maybe you should play something like this just to stay out of trouble. At this point, black could have played this move, and this isn't so easy to handle, isn't so easy to win, because the queens might go off, and black's just solid enough that there's no major way for white to get in, even though he still has all his normal advantages. It's really just the one minor piece, and maybe that emphasizes the fact that it takes more than one advantage to win these positions. But instead he plays that move, which weakens the e6 square. Even though it keeps the knight out of these dangerous squares, e5 and g5, it's just not worth it. So white reorganizes, and now that move. So in fact, rook c8 is probably a mistake, because now there's a forking square there, and that's actually difficult to meet. It's hard to find any way to meet that. He tries to exchange off these rooks and then cover some central squares, but then look what happens. Attacks the rook, counterattacks on the queen. Queen comes back, and guess what? Now this square could be an issue. It's a problem, and the rook's attacked. So the rook attacks the knight, but now Stein, just the check by itself isn't doing that much, but now there's going to be two knights in the vicinity of the king. Obviously, if rook takes now, we can just play knight up check and then take the rook, and that's going to be overwhelming. The bishop's still bad. So he tries to simply move the knight back to cover this square. Got to do that first. And instead of checking, he wins the queen. And so black resigns. So very nice game, and it was a good illustration of these ram pawns, this ram center, But on the other hand, black was more or less in the game, so that was interesting. We had an example where black wasn't just being bowled over, and that was because white didn't have multiple advantages, and in particular space. Okay, here we have a game by the famous Bent Larson against the great English player Jonathan Penrose. You can see that it's been some sort of Tarrasch Queen's Gambit, in fact declined. In fact, Larson often played this fianchetto against it, not a very popular system, but he simply wanted to in fact create an isolated pawn, cover d4, and outplay his opponent. So that's a normal move, and there we go, there's the isolated pawn. Chase it down, try and make some simplification. Maybe you could have taken on e6, but often that helps black's center. So at least one of the pieces off the board that tends to be a little bit better for the player playing against the isolated pawn. On the other hand, there's nothing wrong with black's position, and he challenges that bishop. One thing is that even though he's simplifying here, if he does manage to get rid of that bishop, there's some little weaknesses on the queen side, white's queen side, that can be looked at, and he really shouldn't lose this game. Now that restrains against the move d4, which is, as we all know, is the move that really blows everything open. If you can get d4 in, you open all the lines. This is a little pure isolated queen pawn review. And black puts a rook, gets ready to put a rook on that file. So everything's going pretty normally. If queen takes, we're going to have a little trick there and some material. So this bishop's become more active. It's a fairly poor bishop, but now it's got more scope. Okay, steps out of the pin and puts rooks now are on the absolutely ideal files. Maybe d4 can be played. Maybe we're at the point where d4 is ready to be played. These are all normal moves, and it doesn't seem like anybody has a particularly big advantage. So what does white do to make progress? Aha. So now this is hit many times. Even this might be a little bit of an issue. If the knight moves, the rooks are going to get through. So black takes, white takes with the queen. Threatening to double pawns, threatening to take on a7. Black goes, okay, no biggie. But here we have it again. We have the ram pawn structure, that's these two, and we have the better bishop. Because no matter where that bishop is, then it's still blocked by its own center pawn, and white's isn't. So it's formally a better bishop, and unless the bishops get exchanged, then it's going to be the better bishop in the endgame. The problem is he can't try and exchange off those bishops now, or he's going to have some trouble doing that, because the rook's going to come down in the 7th rank, and that's a real problem. So this is sort of your basic position, and the player with two advantages will usually win this. So he's doubled on the open file, and he has the better bishop. However, it is black's move, and black now should play actively like that, and that's not so easy. Then things get very complicated. So that was what he should have done. Instead, although white's still better, instead what happened in the game was passive defense. Very logical. Control that 7th rank. And that's like the Karpov game we saw a long time ago against Ullman. Sort of when in doubt, expand and try to force that bishop to commit, maybe chase it back. Now if it goes the other way, we even saw in the Karpov game where, well, that puts him away from the center, and this pawn's probably just going to fall. Something's going to fall there. So he really has to go back towards protecting his weak pawn. And there he goes, gains a lot of space. That's the whole idea, just like Karpov did at some point. And we've seen in quite a few of these games. If you can't make progress, if there's no particular way to make concrete progress, take some space and centralize your king. Very logical. It keeps black's rooks out of any territory, and later on it can advance. Black is just basically marking time, and remember that was one of the problems with this kind of position, is that you end up just marking time because there's nothing positive to do. White, for example, could even play a move like h4. Instead he plays a4. He grabs space on the queen side. Black still isn't doing much because he can't get through to any of these squares. Really very interesting game. How is white going to make progress? Well, he just keeps advancing, grabbing more space. Larson rook pawns were famous, but it's not so much a case of the Larson rook pawns as it is of simply you have black completely tied down, gain a bunch of space. Now that's a very nice move. Why would he do that? Why would he go off of this pawn? Well, this pawn's perfectly well protected anyway. So what he's trying to do is simply give more scope to his bishop. We'll make one more move here. There we go. Now it aims towards both sides. Maybe it'll go to b5 at some point. Maybe it'll go to f5 at some point. But more importantly, it just has good range on both sides of the board. And that's more useful than being on g2. Black, again, really can't do much. Okay, white finally tries to make progress, break through, hit the last rank. And it's really perfect timing because all his other pieces are in such good shape. Okay, black gets out of the pin, and white plays another pawn advance. What's his idea? Well, maybe he's going to play this move, and it's no longer possible to play a6. So that's a possibility. So black tries to protect that along this side of the board. He also is maybe a little afraid of b6, followed by rook c7. But now you have the same problem of the rook coming behind the pawn. If he wins this, he gets a passed pawn, and is pretty much going to win the game. So black tries to defend, and it looks like maybe he's going to defend, but there's this cute little idea. Check. So how does that work? Well, if black takes the bishop, white wins material. It's a handy trick to have, because without that it's not actually so easy. So that means black has to retreat so as not to lose his bishop. And now if you look for just a second here, we see that black's in almost Zugzwang, because he can't really abandon the bishop. He can't move the king anywhere without losing the bishop. He can't move his pawns, and if he moves his rook over, he's going to lose the bishop. Well, he's going to get checkmated. And why would he want to move the rook over? So he could hold on to that pawn. So this is not looking good, but he can play there. Why can he play there? Because if the rook takes the pawn now, the bishop can take the bishop. So right now white could probably play bishop takes e8 and win, but he gets sadistic. He decides to simply torture his opponent. Makes another slow move. It's Zugzwang. Now of course he could take, because that's protected. But he decides to finish very nicely actually by advancing that way. And what is he doing that for? Well, maybe we should make a few more moves, but the threat is just so maybe take here and walk in with the king and start taking pawns. And at any point, of course, he can take this one. So actually at this point black simply resigned. Probably, well, let's just see what something he'd probably take there. He might as well get rid of some pawns and stop that plan we just talked about. And then white's going to just walk in. Very nice way to finish the game. Black has to move on the e file somewhere. White presumably will not even worry about that pawn. And he's threatening to take and come over here and come over and win this pawn. So probably better to just take this now that I think about it, because that could become a passed pawn. There's nothing that really black can do anyway. He can give it check, but then he has to come back and cut him off from going here. And at that point, I think it's time to simplify. Yeah, at this point we can just simplify. Take everything off and just play here, and that's going to be a passed pawn. If he ever gets in front of it, he can always sacrifice it and go over and win this pawn and queen the h pawn. So a very nice game, very much in control. What was the problem with the Ram pawn center? Basically the good bishop against the bad bishop, and white got a little too much control of that c file. And what happened was, because of that good bishop and the c file, black had to just move back and forth. And then that was very interesting, because white suddenly did that thing about opening another front by advancing on both the king side and the queen side. So that was a very nice illustration of most of the themes that we've talked about. Okay, I thought we'd harken back to the old Karpov-Ullman game that I mentioned before to finish up the subject of the Ram center. This is a game that we went over in some detail, so I'm just going to kind of rush through it. We're getting out of time anyway. I just thought I'd show what happens. The isolated queen pawn again. Good lesson. Probably black doesn't want to exchange that off, make it easier for white. Very typical standard position. White at least has stopped this possible freeing move. On the other hand, black has really good activity, having no particular issues. White wants to exchange some pieces. Still, we saw this kind of position, especially with Ullman. And here he really shouldn't play that move. He should be bringing the rooks to the center, as we're used to. But it's a very tempting move to play. It's just that it gives him a little bit of a problem, which you'll see in a second. Okay, so there's the exchange, and it turns out he can't take here. We discussed that. I think knight b5 is too strong. Threatens the queen gets stuck and knight c7 is threatened. Maybe that's what Ullman missed. Okay, so there he is challenging the center, and we've already seen that if white takes that, black takes the pawn, and if white has any advantage, it's really very just nominal. So he pins it. And that was the problem with a4, a5, is this bishop's too solidified there, and that gives maybe just a tiny advantage. Okay, gets out of that pin and makes that wonderful move. We talked about that. That's this terrific move, which you'll see the point of in a second. The main point is this is a ram center. So we talked about this game without really talking about the characteristics of the ram center, and now you can see it. Good place to stop. You can see that white has a very good bishop covering a lot of big squares, and black has a bad bishop, same color as his center, and also just out of the way and unable to get to the key squares, cut off from the key squares. So that's your standard advantage, and we'll look and see how that gets developed. Okay, 7th rank, can't argue with that. And he controls the file. So there we have it. We have space, a little bit, maybe more later. We have control of the main file, doubled on the main file, and we have the better bishop. And we've already seen that usually wins. So let's just see how that goes. Attacks the b pawn, doubles. Okay, and the problem now is doubling on the 7th rank and gaining more space. Now threading f5. Black checks a little, might as well. Tries that move against f5. He gives up the f pawn, but what else can he do here? He could try this, but the problem then is he's just losing the b pawn, and the e pawn's going to be under fire. And this is, the king's more centralized. You can kind of imagine that this really just isn't going to work out. Maybe worth a try. Instead he plays this move, even though that looks utterly hopeless. It's only one pawn. Now the rook's kind of trapped, but at least black survived without losing massive material. And he just got back his pawn. The problem is now, of course, the rook's attacked and doesn't really have anywhere to go. So gives him a check, another check, and he has to abandon that pawn. And at this point he actually resigns, because first of all, I guess rook b8 is threatened, followed by an almost instantaneous mate, and if rook d8 then g6, and we'll end the game very, very quickly. Moral of the story is the same one we've had in all of these games. White had all three advantages in this one: the extra space, the better bishop, which is really the most important of all, and control of an open file. So that's the end of the RAM structure. You've seen the same lesson again and again, but that's okay because it comes up again and again, and it's worth knowing for your own games. This has been Beyond the Opening. I want to thank everybody for listening, and I'll be here next week.